We begin with the rise of Shri Sharada Devi, the rediscovering of the Sahasra Nāma of the autumnal goddess Shri Sharada. And as is proper in the beginning of any introduction such as this, we invoke the core mantric powers of the goddess as given, as prescribed in the Sharada Sahasra Nāma. Om Hrim Klim Sharadhaya Namaha. Om Hrim Klim Sharada Kanta Shrimati Shri Shubhankari Shubha Shanta Sharadbhija Shamika Shama Kuntala. These are the first of the 1,000 names of Shri Sharada excerpted from the Sharada Sahasra Nāma. That is to say, her core bij mantras are Hrim and Klim, and with that we see the introduction of the first name, which is Sharada herself, followed by the second, Kanta, Shrimati, the third, etc., etc. And thus flows the 1,000 names of Shri Sharada in the Sahasranama recently discovered. And that is a story that I wish to tell in brief for the rest of this introductory presentation. The Sahasranama of Sharada was discovered as part of the Kashmir Shaivism Preservation Project conducted last year by myself and was made successful through the generous support of donors, mainly in the Western yoga world, through which in May of 2012 I was able to go to Kashmir and purchase approximately 25,000 scanned pages of manuscripts, mainly Shaiva manuscripts that derive from private collections. Manuscripts that are sacred to the cultural and spiritual legacy of Kashmir and beyond, including the Sringeri community, as we'll find out. And so the Sharada Sahasranama was acquired inadvertently through our preservation project, the Kashmir Shaivism Preservation Project conducted last year in Srinagar. Through the generous support of donors in May of 2012, we were able to purchase 25,000 pages of previously inaccessible Shaiva manuscript scans, sacred to the cultural and spiritual legacy of Kashmir and the Sringeri community, as it turns out. And this represents less than 20% of the Shaiva collection still detained in Kashmir. All of these derive from personal collections. And so our overall goal is to attain as many manuscripts as we can and to make them available to spiritual communities that would otherwise or have otherwise been without them. So the scans acquired last year in Kashmir include over 500 manuscripts, 900 individual titles, as I said, 25,000 manuscript pages, 13 genres of Kashmiri Shaiva literature, beautiful paintings that we'll see, and most importantly here, rare stotras, hymns to local Kashmiri goddesses, including a number of Sahasranamas. Amongst these are, as we say, rare Kashmiri goddess stotra Sahasranamas that include the Sharada Sahasranama, hymns to the goddess Sharika, the goddess Ragni, all local goddesses in Kashmir. We also find a number of Sharada hymns that exist in Srinagar yet to be acquired, including the Sharada Mahatmya, the Sharada Pujana, the Sharada Stotra, the Sharada Stuti, and the Sharada Stavaha. And one of these in particular is of great interest, the Sharada Mahatmya, because we know that this was still in use as late as the 1890s when the scholar Oral Stein actually references the Sharada Mahatmya and all the secret mantras and directions in terms of rituals that it gives. And to my knowledge, this has fallen out of our hands and still exists in Kashmir. So part of the funding of this project is to go back and attain many more of the manuscripts that are highly valued by the communities outside of Kashmir now. Here we see an image, a manuscript photo of the Panchastavi, a manuscript belonging to Sri Lalita, or Tripura Sundari. And this includes a very, very rare painting of the goddess Lalita, Here we see Shri Ragni, a goddess from Kashmir who is still venerated at, for instance, the Sringeri temple in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania. She was just venerated in a big homa there over Memorial Day weekend. And with this particular hymn to Ragni, or Stotra Ragni, we see also a painting of the goddess, a very rare painting created inside the manuscript itself. Here's a blow-up of that beautiful painting, probably 500 to 600 years old. Another painting that was acquired in Kashmir was inserted or painted within a manuscript of the Shri Saundarya Lahiri, a very, very sacred text to the goddess Lalita that originates in South India and has great connection to the Vedanta community. This is a painting of Ardhana Ishwara that we see based on several verses from that text. And then last but not least, of course, is the Sharada Sahasra Nāma, authored by Shri Sahajaka, an 8-foot-long scroll measuring approximately 3 feet wide. This single surviving copy of one of the most sacred texts to the matron goddess of Kashmir, a goddess who becomes venerated by the Shankaracharya community, the Vedanta community in Karnataka, of course, and that is where this sect survived, this worship of the goddess Sharada, benevolent mother who is now still worshipped worldwide, but without the sacred Sharada Sahasranama, as we will now find out. So, we continue with the legacy of Shri Sharada. This is a brief background into the history of the goddess, her importance in Kashmir and in the Sringeri communities and beyond. And the story that I'll be telling briefly here is correlated to the Sharada Sahasranama itself, where we find these details within the Sahasranama, but also in the writings of Kashmiri sages such as Abhinavagupta and the historian Kalhana and many other texts. So compiling all this together, we see the facts and figures in terms of how this goddess and her Sahasranama came to the forefront of the consciousness of Kashmiri devotees and those who worship her worldwide. We begin with Kashmir. Long ago, the great sage, the Shaiva sage Shandilya, who is associated with the Gotra of the ancient Vedic sage Kashyapa, a Gotra or lineage which allegedly migrated into Kashmir. Long ago, Shandilya, seeking the boon of spiritual awakening, practiced intense tapas or austerity while worshipping Shri Sharada Devi, the matriarchal goddess of Kashmir. Her name means, Sharada means autumn, and she personifies the liberating light for the Shaivas of the autumn moon. She personifies the liberating light of the autumn moon. After a lot of adventures and a lot of disciplined austerity, a lot of prayers, finally on the evening of the 8th night of the waxing moon in the autumn month of Ashwin, that is to say, Navaratri, as we're told by the Sahasranama, Sharada, who is personifying the moon, who represents the lunar radiance of awakened consciousness, arose on the horizon to fulfill his great desire. Descending into his heart as the penetrating rays of divine moonlight, she flooded Shandilya with the lunar nectar of immortality. Thereafter, her ancient temple was built in the valley of Shardi, the very spot overlooking the valley where she descended into the heart of Shandilya, and as Abhinavagupta says, thenceforth becoming the very heart, the pranic body, the life force of the Kashmiri people. And so as the Sahasranama tells us, thereafter, on the anniversary of that auspicious autumn night in which she appeared and awakened Shandilya, that auspicious autumn night in what is now known as Navaratri, the Kashmiris performed, at least for many centuries, the Sharada Sahasranama, in which the 1,000 names of this beloved goddess were recited in order to unify and bless her people. The text was transmitted through a devotee named Shri Sahajaka, as we're told in the colophon, or the signature line of the scroll. But the Sharada Sahasranama was, of course, eventually lost, As her devotees were forced to disperse, its ritual faded from memory, even as her ancient temple in northern Kashmir fell into ruin. And we know from the records of Oral Stein, for instance, that even the Brahmins in Kashmir, before they went on their final exodus a couple of decades ago, all the way back to the 1890s, there was little record of the Brahmins still pilgrimaging to the temple of Sharada at that point because it was too dangerous. And so the Sahasranama was somehow lost, as was the memory of its performance, or at least on the surface, but not entirely, as we'll find out. But in 2012, a single surviving scroll of Sahajika's sacred Sahasranama was rediscovered, as I mentioned earlier. Here's the first page or partial excerpt of the first page of the scans that I was able to acquire, and herein we can see the beauty of the writing, but also some of the challenges with editing a text like this that survives with numerous errors and rips and tears and so forth. The scroll is composed, as we can see here, in the Kashmiri version of Sanskrit, the script used in Kashmir known as Sharada, named after the goddess. The scroll is composed in the script known as Sharada, the beautiful but largely forgotten form of Sanskrit native to Kashmir and largely forgotten today. Named after the goddess herself, it imbues the text and her 1,000 names with her very power and presence. And this is celebrated by many, many Kashmiri sages, that any text written in the language of Sharada has the very vibrational energy of the goddess herself. And that is why the script is called Sharada, for she is the matron goddess of Kashmir. And so with the revival of her most sacred ritual, her Sahasranama Puja, the beloved goddess Shri Sharada again rises here in 2012 as the very vital essence, Shakti, that unites her devotees in Kashmir and beyond, throughout the Sringeri community, all over the world, where the power of Saraswati, the flowing grace of awakened consciousness, lunar consciousness, is celebrated and worshipped. Sri Abhinavagupta, who lived at the turn of the first millennium, sings the praises of Sharada as the very heart of the Kashmiri people. But this verse can be applied, of course, to all of her devotees everywhere. Yatra swayam Sharada chandra shubraha Shri Sharadeti pratita janishu Shandilya seva rasasu prasanna Sarvam janam swavi bhavaryunakti. The radiant goddess called Autumn is venerated wherever she manifests herself amongst the people as the beautiful incandescence of the autumn moon. She who is pleased by the sweet reverence of Shandilya unites all of her people through the expression of their own magnanimity. And so, the legacy of Sharada, of course, does not end with the exodus of the Kashmiris from Kashmir, of the Pandit community, but through great good fortune, we have the worship of Sharada that survives all over the world vis-a-vis the Sringeri community founded by the legendary sage and avatara Shankaracharya. And it is said, according to legend and lore, that Shankara journeyed to Kashmir and became a devotee of the goddess. And as we see in this photo, the Shankaracharya temple still stands where he allegedly received the transmission from Sri Sharada Devi in Srinagar some 12.5 centuries ago. And established in South India, in Karnataka, by the legendary sage Shankaracharya, is his Sri Sharada Peetham in Sringeri in Karnataka. Otherwise known as the Shri Jagadguru Shankaracharya Maha Samsthanam Dakshinamnaya Sri Sharada Peetham. This is the great Dakshinayana, or southern pilgrimage place, the first major Peetham set up by Shankaracharya, and the legendary succession of gurus began after his departure from this world around 820 AD, and 36 acharyas have followed as leaders of the spiritual community for which Shri Sharada is the matron goddess, including today's present acharya, the 36th master, Jagadguru Shankaracharya, Shri Shri Bharati Tirtha Mahaswamiji, from 1989 forward. And here we see Mahaswamiji giving reverence to the Murti on the right of beloved Shri Sharada Devi. Also, in many extensions of this community, we have temples built all around the world to Sharada, including in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, which is an important center because it is also the place where the Kashmiri community, also worshippers, of course, still of Sharada, even though now in exile, this is where they gather for regular annual rituals and to foster a sense of communal connection to the goddess in all forms. Here's a couple of pictures of the most recent hava to another Kashmir goddess, that of Ragni, the queen, performed in the Sharada temple in Stroudsburg or by the Kashmiri Pandit community and the priests of the temple. And so we see the Murti here of Sharada in Stroudsburg, and then finally again in the original Mother Pitam in Sringeri, the Sri Sharadamba Pitam. And so Sharada survives today in many places with tremendous devotion, but without her original Sahasranama, the core ritual of any major deity in terms of a temple culture that seeks to attune with their deity regularly and yearly. And so the temples around the world of Sri Sharada have managed to go on without this sacred ritual. But now, due to great good fortune, we can celebrate its auspicious return.